all of the Gospels they weren't written in a vacuum. They were written to specific situations. Now, we don't always know with 100% certainty what those situations are, but a lot of times we can extrapolate from the issues that they're dealing with. It's pretty simple. They're all written, obviously, sometime after the death of Jesus, which is around 33, 34-ish. They tend to be written 2 or 3 decades later. Paul, the earliest letters in the New Testament are Paul's letters. They're not in chronological order. So the first gospel, almost certainly, and people love to debate this, but the first gospel was almost certainly Mark. And Mark was written to a very specific situation. It was written right after 64 AD, July. I can actually say July of 64 AD, when there was a fire in Rome, the Great Fire in Rome. And we know from secular historians that the Christians were blamed for that fire by Nero. And so persecution for the first time breaks out in the church. The Gospel of Mark is written to that community of Christians in Rome. And once you know that, the Gospel of Mark really comes to life. So Mark is the earliest one. Now, whoever came next is sort of up for grabs. It's got to be either Luke or Matthew, because clearly John was written last. I would like to say that Luke was written next, but I won't take a bullet for it. Luke was a companion of Paul. We know that. We know that Luke was a doctor, and we know that as a companion of Paul, he was traveling with Paul, so he was aware of all the different problems in the early church that people were dealing with. We also know that Luke wasn't an eyewitness, which is very important. He tells us that. It's very important then to realize that all of his testimonies are interviews. He's talked to people who knew Jesus and saw Jesus. The life situation of Luke's gospel is not as clear, other than the fact that Luke is writing sometime before the death of Paul, and Luke is a bridge between the Gospels, between the time when Jesus was living and the times when Jesus was no longer present. I think that's the important position of Luke. Matthew, which is the Gospel I'm working on right now, Matthew, to me, has one of the most interesting backgrounds. Matthew is written either slightly before or slightly after 70 AD, and if you're into New Testament history at all, 70 AD is a huge date for you. That's when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and everything changes. Okay, so this is the life situation of Matthew. Matthew is writing to Jewish Christians who don't know they're Christians yet. They're faithful Jews in the synagogue, I believe, in Galilee. We can talk about that later if we have time. And he's writing to this group of Jewish Christians who are about to, or who have just been, thrown out of the synagogue. That's why I say it's written just before or just after 70 AD. Because what happens in 70 AD is that Judaism was very fragmented and used to be many things. After 70 AD, it becomes one thing. It basically becomes Phariseeism, because the Pharisees are the only people that are left standing after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. And so Matthew is writing to that community. And so there's all kinds of, especially for me, there's all kinds of issues of identity. You're a Jewish person, you're kicked out of the synagogue, you no longer have an identity. If you read Matthew, understanding that background, the whole book just comes to life. And then finally John, almost certainly, I mean, the 99% position is that John was written last. It's a much more sophisticated gospel. It's clearly written by someone who has been preaching and thinking and processing these truths for a long, long time. That fits John, I think, clearly. John at this point is in Ephesus. He's dealing with all kinds of issues very late, in that period, like worshiping John the Baptist. Lots of Gnostic, false images of who Jesus is. There's a big strain in the church in John's time that deny the incarnation, and there's all sorts of, we see hints of this in some of Paul's letters. And that's the situation that John is writing to, and it makes perfect sense. Then John opens his gospel with a statement about the incarnation. So you see, they're all written to different communities and different periods, And but if I don't know, Chris, if you're a pointy-headed fundamentalist like I am, but I believe they're all perfect, and they provide this wonderful four-dimensional image of who Jesus is.